Okay, so my name is Stan Wilson, and I'm the infrastructure coordinator for the Skills for the New Millennium Tour. And we are a donation-based sustainable living tour. We've been on the road for the last 3 years. We're taking a bit of a hiatus now to attend graduate school and for me to get my BA and just to spend some time in Missoula. This has been where we've lived in or near or around for the last 10 years, but we haven't been here for the last 3, so we've kind of felt home calling louder and louder the more time we spend on the road. So that's who I am, and I do have a website. It's www.permibus.org. There's a lot of information on there about composting, about working with chickens, about vermiculture, about a lot of the different things that we're going to talk about today. So that's who I am, and that's where you can find out more information about me. That also has all the contact information you would need to get a hold of me, my telephone number, my email address, and everything. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about composting, and we're going to talk about a few different aspects of composting. I want to thank MCAT for coming out here and videotaping this, and people will be able to download this composting workshop from MCAT online and also watch it on the air. So this is information that will be available to people for a while to come. I also want to thank MUD for allowing me to have this thing here. It's nice to be in Missoula and working with MUD. They're a group that we've been involved with on and off for the last 10 years. And one of the things we wanted to do when we came back here was to make sure that we were able to have a presence here at MUD. So let's talk about composting. And the first question I always ask when it comes to composting is, what is composting? Well, composting is a very, very simple thing. It's organic matter decomposing. And so composting happens all around us. You know, the primary method of building soil is composting. That's what nature does. That's how nature builds soil, nature composts. And so that's really, really simply what composting is. It's organic matter decomposing. Another question around what composting is then there are two different words, biodegradable and compostable. Many of the things that we have around us on a daily basis are what are referred to as biodegradable. If you look at a label on plastic containers and that, they'll say biodegradable. Really everything on the planet pretty much to one degree or another is biodegradable. For that matter, nuclear waste is biodegradable. It just takes a quarter of a million years to get it done. Many materials are biodegradable. The question is how quickly do they biodegrade? And that's when we get into what is compostable. Because compostable materials are materials that biodegrade and turn to soil in a more rapid period of time. So organic matter is all biodegradable. If it comes out of the ground or falls down from trees, it's all compostable material. And that's what we're working with when we're working with compost, is those things that we can then compost and turn to soil. Which gets us to the next question, is that why do we want to compost in the first place? And for a number of years, the answer to this question would have been, I don't want to compost in the first place, because composting can be a little labor intensive. It's also, the compost bin over the last, since the 1950s has not been a normal part of the milieu of the suburban and or urban neighborhood. And maybe even in many rural areas, you'll find people who, when I go talk to them about composting, they say things like, yeah, my dad composted years ago, and then we stopped. And that's a shame, because what happens when we stop composting is that all of that material that we would normally compost and use to build soil goes where? It goes into the dump, and then it becomes waste. And that's when organic materials are wasted. So the reason to compost, the primary reason for me to compost, is to build soil. And the reason why I want to build soil is because I want to grow food. And food needs good soils to be grown in. So all of us can take responsibility for the soils that we grow our food in by building our own soils. And it's an easy process. The process of composting can be as easy as doing little or nothing. The process of composting, it really depends upon how much involvement you want to have in your compost pile. For some people, they want to go out there, they want to put the stuff on there, they want to put a cover over it, and they want to let nature take its course, and they're really not too interested in how long it takes to compost. Other people are more energetic, and they like to get out there and turn their compost pile, and there's benefits and deficits to both ways of doing it. The other reason for composting is to sequester carbon. And when people ask me what the most important things they can do as far as, our interaction with global climatic change is, don't go to an Al Gore lecture on climate change. Sorry, Al, but Al Gore flew to that lecture. And then he went to a hotel, and then he got in the limousine and he drove to where he was actually giving the lecture. So at every step until he got to the podium to tell you the terrible things that are going on with climate change, he's been burning up greenhouse gases to get there. The most important thing we can do about global climatic change is sequester carbon. And the easiest way to sequester carbon is to simply compost, to build soil. Carbon in the ground is not a problem. Carbon doesn't become a problem until too much of it gets into the atmosphere. So when we compost, we're sequestering carbon, we're putting it back where it belongs, where it can actually be of use. And the other thing is an idea that a guy named Chuck, I'm going to make sure I have his name, Chuck Marsh, he's a permaculture teacher in North Carolina, talks about a lot is carbon banking. And what the philosophy of carbon banking is that the process of farming that we have been using to grow crops with for the last 60 years or so has been stripping carbon out of the soil. And so carbon banking is a way of putting carbon back into the soil, not only for immediate use, but also to bank the carbon in order for future generations to have carbon in the soil. For when they build soil, they have, something to work with. And carbon banking can be as easy as a compost pile. That's a form of carbon banking. Chuck Marsh likes to do things like dig big swales out in his backyard and then throw all of his paper waste into those swales with straw and let it decompose to the swales. He lives in a rural area. He lives in an intentional community. His neighbors don't dislike it enough to really make any problems for him, but oftentimes I guess people do view him as simply littering. And so, carbon banking, I think in an urban or suburban area, the best way to deal with carbon banking is to simply build a compost pile and start banking carbon. And so those are the two best reasons to compost. Composting can also be, in a way, kind of fun. I enjoy working with compost. It really gets you in direct contact with how soil is built, what you want to do to ensure that you're building your best soils, and you get to become one with an organic process. And I think as many places where we can, as predominantly urban or suburban dwellers, become involved with, these organic processes all around us, it makes us better gardeners. It also makes us better citizens of the planet. I mean, it's one thing to go to the store and buy a bag of organic compost. That's a good thing to do. It's another step to create your own organic compost. And the other thing that does is in the area of self-sufficiency and sustainability, everything we can find to do as communities, as individuals, to meet those needs for ourselves, we're taking a greater step towards sustainability. And one of the end results of composting and doing all of this work is finding a way to make not only our families but the communities around that we live in as sustainable as possible. So I'm going to go over here and grab my notes. And there, one of the things we got from Mud is the dirt on compost. This is their information sheet on compost. There's a couple of things about in here that I'm going to challenge just a little bit because I do a couple of different types of composting to make some of these things more practical. I'm also a strong believer in composting or in backyard gardening and involving as many different entities in every process as I can. So for me, part of composting is composting with animals. I have a worm bin, I do vermiculture. I also use my chickens as part of my composting process. That has some large benefits. It also has some problems associated with it. So I'm just going to take a second to look over here real quick. So let's talk a little bit about different ways of composting. The traditional way of composting, if we want to bring the camera over here, is a system much like this. They have 3 bins, and as I understand it, the purpose of the second bin is it's kind of overflow for the first bin. But so it's basically a 2-bin system with a little bit extra room because you're going to fill the system up faster than you probably can imagine when you have this much green material around you. So what this is that there's a mixture of 2 to 1 of materials in here. When you're composting, what you want to have is dry materials, and that can be straw. I highly recommend straw. That can be old moldy hay, which is what I'm using right now because I don't have straw. It can be wood chips, it can be sawdust. There's a lot of different materials you can use. I prefer straw because I think it's the simplest material. It does a really, really good job of helping the wet matter decompose, and it also keeps flies down really well. And some of the other covers I don't think work all that well, especially at doing things like keeping flies down. Wood chips, you got to be really careful about wood chips and make sure it's not coming from treated wood. The same thing is true of sawdust. You have to be really careful about sawdust and make sure it's not coming from treated wood. Otherwise, you're putting a toxic substance into your compost pile. Heavy metal, and we're trying to do as much as possible to get heavy metals out of the soil, and putting heavy metals into the soil then becomes just another problem.
The comfrey is apparently really good for the compost.
The comfrey is an excellent thing to put into the compost. And so what they're doing here is they're just putting food waste, household waste, and yard waste into a compost pile and then mixing it with straw. And I imagine they come out here from time to time and turn this.
Not lately.
Not lately. This is a compost method that is based on, to a degree, on turning. And I used to be a big fan of turning compost because when you turn compost, what happens is that you intensify the natural action that is going on. So it heats the compost bin up really, really fast. It also disturbs the biological process. And turning too much can end the biological process so that every time you're done turning, you have to restart. What I started doing when I was still turning compost is that I would come out in the spring and I would turn the compost real good because it had been sitting freezing all winter long. And then I would come out at the end of fall, the beginning of winter, right after the frost had come, and I would turn my compost pile to let it get one really, really good blast of heat before winter came, and it settled down. So that was when I would start turning my compost. I used to turn the compost all the time. It was a great way of working out frustration and everything. And I'm older now. My back isn't as the best friend of the pitchfork anymore. And so I've used another method. So what they have over here is they have their overflow bin. And you can see that this is in a bit of a different state than this one here is. This is what they're using right now. So this is full. I would like to see a little bit more straw on here covering some more of this, just to keep the flies somewhat at bay. There's not a lot of flies right now, and if this was, a normal late summer in Missoula, it might be more of a problem. Luckily, we have global climatic change going on here in Missoula, and so the flies aren't going to be that much of a problem right now because it's already getting colder. But I would add a little bit more straw to this, if this was my compost pile. And then you have your overflow. Then over here you have your finished product. And so this is the finished compost. I'm going to bring some of this over to the camera because this is a good example of what finished compost ought to look like. Finished compost doesn't look like soil. It looks like compost. And this is deep and rich. It's still got some, the eggshells haven't quite broken down.
No, it smells a little bit.
It smells earthy if it has a smell at all. So this is a really, really good example of finished compost. I'd like to see some of these eggshells broken down in there a little bit more, and that's probably turning to get it a little bit hotter. But otherwise, that's a really, really, really nice looking compost. So let's put this back where it belongs. I don't do this method of composting. What I do is called the lasagna method, and it's the method of composting that I teach. And the lasagna method is really simple, and that's what I like about it. I refer to it as a lazy man's version of composting. And what it is that I used a pallet method, mainly because pallets are free. There's a lot of other different things you can do to build compost bins. I highly recommend that you don't spend any money at all on those black things. They do in some areas in the country, they're actually mandated by regulation, and that has to do a lot with pest. But what they do is they're black, and they have a couple of holes in them, and they get really hot, but they don't really get a good airflow. And they have the ones that you tumble, and you might as well just be out there with your compost bin with a pitchfork. And I've seen compost come out of them. They work. They're expensive. I don't think they work all that well. And unless you really live in a place where you pay enough in property taxes that your neighbors have mandated something like that, there's really no reason to go down to anywhere and buy one. You can do perfectly good composting right in your backyard, right out of a few pallets, without having your neighbors complain about the smell or anything. It's just a matter of, paying attention to what's going on with your compost. So what I do is what I call the lasagna method. I use pallets. Pallets are cheap. They should be free. If anybody's trying to charge you for pallets, just drive down the next alley. And what I do is I put up 3 pallets. I use rebar. I put rebar in the ground and then set the pallets over the rebar. That keeps the pallets from moving around. And then I'll put some baling wire around them to make sure that they're relatively tight. And then put some sticks on the bottom of the ground and put some straw in there. And what that does is it gets your initial level of compost off the ground, which means airflow is coming underneath of it. And the thing about pallets is they allow for a lot of airflow because they're open. And then the straw is the first layer of what you're going to put your waste on. And what you do is I put my waste on, and depending upon how much waste if you cover the straw layer with waste the first time you put a load into the compost pile, you want to then immediately cover it with straw. If you're throwing, a yogurt container full of compost in the pile, I don't worry about covering that, because what that does is it throws off your balance of dry material to wet material. And you want to go about 2 to 1. And if you start getting too much dry material in, one of the things we'll talk about are problems associated with compost. If every time you throw a yogurt container of compost in your compost pile and then you cover it with straw, you're going to have too much dry material and not enough wet material, and your composting action is going to come to a stop. But that's all it is it's like building lasagna. It comes out of sheet mulching, but it's less complicated. It's a layer of straw, a layer of waste, a layer of straw until you're done, and then you cap it and then let it sit. And the answer to the question, how long does it have to sit before it becomes finished compost? The permaculture answer to that question is it depends. It depends upon where you live. How long do you take? Do you know?
I think we've turned that twice this summer. Well, twice this growing season.
Mm-hmm.
And the stuff that's at the far finished end is probably generated from the pile that looked more like that at the end of last growing season. So anywhere from 3 to 6 months,
mm-hmm.
depending on the conditions. And we actually right now run that system closer to how Stan is describing, in that we turn it when we run out of room. Other than that, the pile just sits there, and it still breaks down without any help from anyone else.
Yeah, in nature, you'll never see, Mother Nature out in nature with a pitchfork turning anything. It's a matter of, the whole idea of manipulating compost has to do with how quickly do you want it to become soil? How quickly do you want it to become finished compost? In the bus, we did a couple of things that made it so we could take food waste and turn it into finished compost in 3 to 6 weeks, which, we have no storage capacity whatsoever because we were in a bus, which was pretty quick. And it really became popular for people across the country to get permibus compost and permibus worms, because one of the methods of composting we used was vermiculture. This is the compost recipe, and I think I'm just going to read it right off here. It's a blend of green nitrogen-rich and brown carbon-rich materials. So that's your wet-dry mixture. The ratio is 2 to 1 green to brown materials. So green materials are kitchen scraps, lawn clippings, fresh manure. Actually, fresh manure should not go in your compost pile. It should go in your humanure pile. The temperature at which you have to get manure, when you have to get animal waste to break down to be pathogen free, is a little different than what you're doing in a compost pile. And here you don't have to worry about it. You're not going to develop any pathogens in there. When you start adding manure to that, when you start adding pathogens, and so you have to do something separate in order to make sure that you get your manure hot enough to kill pathogens.
Stan, what if you had the situation where we do here, where we have our chickens over there, they're not defecating in the compost pile, can we, after a certain amount of time, just go in there and sort of mine a layer off the top of their run and integrate that? Or would you still want to treat that?
No, I would treat that. I would put that. What I would do is that when I had chickens in an environment like this, I always had them on straw. And then as I needed to clean their kennel, to clean their sleeping area out, I would just take all the straw out and I would stack it next to the compost pile, and that's what I would use to cover the compost. Things like chicken waste and pigeon waste, which is really, really high in nitrogens, and that sort of thing isn't necessarily a problem. The problem comes in when you start using things like mammalian waste. That's when you really get into problems. We're not really, it's a bigger threat having it left in there and never cleaned out than it is putting it into your compost. So chicken manure is one of those things that is very, very popular in composting. So things like poultry isn't really a problem. Cows, horses is something, because now you're getting the mammalian waste. Right. And that's where you start getting pathogens that can interact with humans in a negative way.
And rabbits?
Rabbits are fine too. Yeah, they just don't create enough. And usually you let it sit. I mean, nobody's going to, if you were mining all that stuff fresh, I would be a little concerned, but generally it's setting in something before it's put in. So it's having a chance to have the sun or the elements kill it off. So green materials include your kitchen scraps, lawn clippings, things like poultry manure. Brown or dry leaves, wood chips, sawdust, paper products, hay, ash, and things like that. You can take all of, and even on something like this, any newspaper, anything with newsprint on it, the newsprint is soy-based, because they simply can't afford to use non-soy based inks. So soy-based inks, newspapers and stuff like that, and some people even compost that shiny stuff. I don't. But all that stuff can go into a compost pile, or you can do it separately. If you put it into the compost pile whole like this, it's going to take it longer to break down. So that's why, it's really, really much better to simply recycle the paper and reuse the paper. But this is a source of carbon banking. Is putting things like old flyers and newspapers and that into a place to where they can become composted, and that's why some people do their carbon banking separately, because everything that you throw in there, you have to say how much time is this adding to the process, and so and then there's time and moisture, and so you can include nearly anything. If it came from a plant, it can go into your compost pile. Here they say exclude fatty foods, meat and dairy products, oil and oily foods, dog and cat manure. And I don't know what they mean by oily foods.
Fried chicken.
Okay, well you should, yeah. I don't, the main reason why I don't put things like that in my compost pile is because I have a dog. And we have this real mentality around sustainability that every calorie you feed your four-legged friends that you didn't have to buy for them is a good calorie. So none of that stuff ever goes into our compost pile. All the old dairy products I tend to give to the chickens. If you have bad milk and you leave your milk setting out and you let it actually clump, the chickens absolutely love that. And it's an enormously good source of protein for them. And since chickens look for an enormous amount of protein in their diet, all that stuff can go to the chickens, which is a form of composting it, because then the chickens are going to create waste, and that waste is then going to go into your compost pile. So I don't tend to do things like throw meat scraps and old dairy into the compost. The truth is that you can, and it will compost. It does attract, critters you may not want around. I don't worry about that very much because we've always owned a dog. Many of our solutions to problems like how do you deal with rodents in compost piles comes with the fact that we have a dog. So you can put that stuff into the compost pile. You don't want to, and you don't, you want to, be mindful of what you're doing, I guess is what I want to say. If you have a pail of old milk, don't dump a pail of old milk into your compost pile.
And I think that's predominantly why that include, exclude sort of notation is made on this outline.
And one of the
Circumvent some potential issues. Not that it wouldn't break down over time, but it can complicate.
It can't, fatty foods attract scavengers. Meat will attract scavengers. Old dairy will attract scavengers. Meat and dairy does carry microbes that can transmit disease. Your compost pile should be hot enough to take care of that. The other thing you can do with meat is that if you're, and you probably can't do this in Missoula, but if you were composting humanure, you could put your meat in your humanure pile, and your humanure pile will get hot enough to kill pathogens. And that's the other thing about pet manure, is that pet manure transmits disease as well. And that's why we have, another form of composting. There's a couple of things I want to talk about in composting. Humanure. And that's something that is a really, really tricky question. In most cities, humanure is illegal. I don't know how the county of Missoula feels about it, but human waste is a wonderful source of soil building material. And in order to compost humanure or any other kind of mammalian manure, what you have to be conscious of is how hot is it getting. So what you do is, and I use this, it's the lasagna method. I use the same, pallet bin method. And all I do is I make sure that I start with a good layer of straw. Like I'll do what is that, about 1/8 of a bale. I'll do a stack about like that to start with. Make sure the stack's up off the ground a little bit so that it's getting air. And when you add your animal waste to the pile, what you want to do is cover it with straw immediately because of questions like odor and that. Now, composting humanure is a really, really easy system. There's a guy by the name of Joel Jenkins who wrote the book, The Humanure Handbook. And you can go online to humanurehandbook.org and you can download the book for free. And he tells you everything there is that you're going to want to know about composting human waste. What we did on the bus was that we had a bucket and we had sawdust. And first part of the process, put sawdust in the bucket before anybody ever uses it. That keeps things from sticking to the bottom of the bucket. And then every time you go to the bathroom, you cover it with sawdust. When the bucket is full, you take it to the compost bin, to the humanure bin, you dump it, you cover it with straw. Now the thing about sawdust, especially if you can get fresh sawdust, is that sawdust still contains the sugars from the wood. And as the sugars decompose in the bucket, what they're doing is that they're intensifying the process of breaking down the manure. So you actually begin, the bucket becomes more than just storage. You actually begin composting materials in your bucket. So that makes the entire process go faster. And then when your humanure bin, when your compost bin is full, you cap it. I put straw over the top, probably because we live out in a rural area. I would put tarp over the top just to make sure that the thing is covered. And then wait, and it's usually 6 to 8 months depending upon where you live. And what you should get out of that is good, rich, finished compost. And you can put all of your animal waste, all of your pet waste goes into there. If it came from a mammal, you can compost it like you compost humanure, because that's really what you're doing when you're doing humanure, is just composting mammalian waste. The other thing we like to look at is using worms, which is called vermiculture. Worms are really, really nice because worms speed up the process of breaking down the compost. And there's a lot of different ways you can interact with worms. I know people who just have worms in their compost bin. And if they have to, they replenish them when they start seeing fewer worms than they would like to see. I keep my worms in a separate container. I do that for a couple of reasons. I want to make sure that I always have worms, and worms can migrate out. And one of the classic problems with having worms in your compost bin is that one day you discover you don't have any worms, and you don't know how long you haven't had any worms. In the wintertime around here, it gets cold enough to kill worms. The worms will go deep underground. In some places, if they know they have a good food source, the worms will stay. And when spring comes, you'll see that you still have a fair amount of worms. and there'll be enough worms for the worms to reproduce. I like to have a little bit better control over things than that. I keep my worms, right now they're in a box that's lined with black plastic so that they can't get through the box. We're going to transfer that into an old bathtub and then cover the bathtub with straw. And what you do to start a worm bin is that you want to get yourself some worms. Any worm will do. The preferred worm of composters is the red wiggler. The reason why the red wiggler is the preferred worm is because it composts the fastest. I have a mixture right now of red wigglers and earthworms because I have worms from 3 or 4 different locations. I'm trying to build the national worm bin and take worms from everywhere. I tell people sometimes I'm working on building the super worm, the worm that can survive anything. And you start the worms off with stripping paper into small strips, getting it about as moist as a wrung out sponge, and then putting the worms in there, and then covering them with another layer of newspaper that's about as wet as a wrung out sponge. You leave that for about a week. The worms will start going through that paper, they'll start eating the paper, and they'll get themselves established. And then you just start giving them food waste. Now there's some things that you don't want to give worms. Worms love bananas, but they won't eat a banana peel. Worms love avocados, but it takes them a long time to break down an avocado peel. Things like avocado peels and banana peels, worms have a hard time working with. I mean, they'll do it eventually, and some people have had more success than others with things like banana peels and that, but they love old bananas. I put, a little bit of old yogurt in my worm bin from time to time. Generally, that all goes to the chickens. I don't tend to put things like meat in the worm bin. I just tend to leave it all, vegetable matter. And anything that comes out of your household, out of your kitchen, the worms will eat. Generally, if the chickens will eat it, the worms will eat it, and if the chickens won't eat it, the worms won't eat it. There are some things that are just too acidic. Orange peels, citrus. Worms don't do well with that. If you throw a chicken an orange, they'll come and peck at it and they'll go away. It's just lemon, lime, all that stuff is just simply too acidic for them. So tomatoes are fine. Tomatoes tend to, because you can take generally the tomatoes in small pieces and you can take and squish it and turn it mainly into liquid. The other reason why I keep my worms separate is because I sell worms, and also because I want the worm castings, because the worm castings are the base ingredient in compost tea. And worm castings are just, the liquid that forms in your worm bin that comes from the fact that worms have a life in there. And I bleed that off, mix that with gray water, mix it with, you can get a compost tea recipe online. If you just put in compost tea and then do a Google search, you'll come up with a variety of different compost tea recipes. And compost tea is a really, really wonderful thing to have around. If you have all of your worms in your compost bin, there will be the components of compost tea in your finished compost, but you won't have compost tea. And compost tea is like superfood for plants. And that's why you want to have that around separate. And so that's why I keep my worms separate, so I can always bleed off compost tea from them. And then I have worms to sell as well. And so that kind of, helps diversify what I'm doing with the worms. The other thing I do is what I call an animal integrated system in composting. And what that means is that you can do this with cats. I'm not a big cat person because I'm allergic to them, but you can do it with cats. I have dogs and chickens. And so what I do is I take my food waste and I give it to my chickens. And when the chickens are done with it, I give it to my worms. And when my worms are done with it, they've created compost. And then I make use of the compost. The dogs, anything that's greasy, anything that's fatty, anything that's meat, anything like that, the dogs all get. And so, what they're doing is they're cleaning up the dishes to keep a lot of that grease and everything out of my gray water, so I don't have to have a filtering system on my gray water. I don't have to have a grease trap to keep all that stuff out. My dogs are my grease trap. If you come over to my house to eat, I invite you at the end of every meal to please set your plates down on the floor so the dogs can have their fun. And so they become part of the composting system. There's some problems about that, about having the chickens and the worms and all that part of your composting system. And the main problem is that it takes away from materials that you're going to be putting into your compost bin. So that shrinks what you're working with in your compost bin, which means that now you have to be more careful about your mixture. And it can be a problem. For most people, it probably wouldn't be a problem. But if you notice that you're just not getting enough food waste in that compost bin, you might want to start, either backing off what you're feeding the chickens or just finding more source of wet materials to put into your compost. And so what I do with my compost bin is that I farm out buckets to people. And so they have a compost bucket at their house that is then going back to my house and goes into my compost bin. And so, because I know some people who just can't have a compost bin on their property. Their dogs are not, they have the bad dogs. The dogs that think that digging in the compost bin is the best thing in the world to do. And so that's, a few different things of doing with animals in a compost system. So, looking at compost and looking at problems that we have with compost, I'm going to go back over here and stand by the compost bin. This is a little dry. Yeah, I guess it's not too bad in there. There's two things that can happen with a compost bin. It's either too wet or it's too dry. And so the solution is immediately obvious. If your compost bin is too wet, if it smells, if it's got flies buzzing around it and everything, you need to add more dry material. That means cover your load better. If it's too dry, if it's just this kind of lifeless thing sitting there that is becoming a home for rodents, what you need to do is add more moist material. You can do that by finding more sources of wet materials to put into your compost pile. The other thing you can do is take your hose and stick it in here somewhere. Just turn it so it's on trickle and then finish your day. Come by and check it from time to time because you don't want to have water running out of your compost bin. That means that now you're drenching it. But usually by the end of a good day in the garden, 2 to 4 hours, you can then just shut the hose off. And you will have addressed the it's too dry issue. So if you're having flies and you have an odor problem, you'll notice that your compost bin is wet and you need to dry it out. If it's dry and nothing's going on, then you need to add moisture and that will rejuvenate it. And if you're adding moisture because your compost bin is too dry, you probably want to turn it as well. I don't turn compost piles that are too wet. I just simply dry them out because then I'm mixing all that wet material in and I'm not giving the dry material a chance to cover it and back down on the wetness. But if it's dry, then turning the compost pile and giving it a chance to heat up quickly, and that's what turning does. It just heats everything up really, really fast. That's a good thing to do because you've probably lost most of your heat. If you're too dry, you're almost better off with a pile that's leaning towards too wet because it's holding heat. And you can actually, if you want to know the best way to know how your compost bin is doing is to simply, feel it. There's still there is still moisture in there. I would add, I might add some more wet materials to it. I don't know if I'd put a hose on it yet. But you have the whole apple season coming up soon. So soon you'll have more wet materials than you can possibly deal with, and so it won't be a problem. So those are the two biggest things that can happen with a compost pile: is that they're too wet or they're too dry. Another thing is another concern we talked about is dairy and meat. And I really would prefer that everybody diversify and get something like chickens and let them take care of your dairy problem. Don't feed meat to your chickens. Chickens, will eat meat. Chickens will absolutely, anything that jumps in there is fair game to a chicken. I've seen chickens, we were in a parking lot in Pennsylvania and I just set the chickens out because when we traveled on the bus, we traveled with 3 hens. I just set them out and a frog jumped in there and that frog was decimated in seconds. I was like, whoa, aggressive hens. But don't feed your chickens meat, and go ahead and compost it if you don't have a dog. If you have a dog, give the dog the meat. The dog will love you. And it's breaking down greases and everything for you and doing your dishes even if you have running water a lot easier. So those are the primary problems associated with composting. So what should your compost bin smell like? That's a real thing that your nose tells you a lot what's going on in your compost bin. It should smell earthy. When I was a kid and they first started having co-ops and health food stores, you'd walk into a store and you could smell the produce from the moment you walked in the door because it smelled like it had actually been in soil. It smelled earthy, and that's what your compost bin should smell like. If it smells sour, if it smells rancid, if it just stinks, then you have a problem. If it has no odor whatsoever, you have a dead pile of stuff sitting there doing nothing. And so those are the primary tools for knowing what's going on with your compost. Work. How much work do you want to do with your compost pile? If you're like me and you don't want to do a lot of work with your compost pile, then you want to use the lasagna method. And you can just do this. I mean, my sister-in-law I don't know what she's doing with her compost pile, but she creates compost. You can do this and just turn it from time to time. You can do the lasagna method. If you're doing the lasagna method, I only turn it twice a year. In the beginning of the spring and at the end of the fall. The lasagna method really should be about as labor-free as you can get. This is a lot more labor, which, if you want to do it, certainly, or if you have, energetic young men around your house a lot that need direction, and you just, they get on your nerves after about 10 minutes and need something to do if they're too energetic. And so, go out and turn the compost pile. It's something for people to do. I do all this work by myself, so I do it as little as possible. So it depends upon how much work you want to do. Time, you actually broke this down, which is good because I always tell people, it takes what it takes. That's how long it takes to compost because I'm never around a compost. For the last 3 years, I haven't been around a compost pile long enough to see a compost pile finish. So 4 to 6 weeks in warm weather, you should have finished compost. In cold weather, the composting process slows. It will continue. The colder the weather gets, the slower the process gets. So when we have these long, cold summers, you're not composting as quickly as when, the good old days when summer in Missoula involved at least a few days over 100. So it really depends upon, to a degree, what the weather's like. And it takes what it takes. One of the things you can do in the winter time is actually take your finished compost pile and cover it, turn it really good, then cover it with a tarp, and that'll help it hold heat longer because the heat isn't rising up out of it. It's got one avenue of heat that it's losing, and that can help your compost pile hold heat over the winter a little bit more. So inside the compost pile, the temperature should reach approximately 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think you can go to the garden store and buy composting thermometers. You can take a meat thermometer or a candy thermometer and stick it in there. If you have a partner or a significant other, he or she has that tool for a reason, and I don't advise doing that. And what I do to tell what temperature my compost pile is I stick my hand in it and see if it's warm. It's not going to if it's warm enough to burn you, then, quick, start running pipes through that and heating water off of it. But, it will be warm. And if it's warm in there, it's warm enough. And that's how I tell whether my compost pile is warm or not, is I just stick my hand in it. And so 160 degrees is what we're shooting for. You want to go to about 170 to 180 degrees if you're doing human manure. Just get it a little bit hotter because you're killing pathogens. So compost, the cost of composting systems, if you stay away from those things that they sell you at all the, big stores, composting should be free. Really, it should be free. I mean, you can get chicken wire, you can get welded wire and make a little fence. And if you're just doing a small compost bin, that's probably worth your while. If you get a run of welded wire, I think you can get, welded wire. A compost bin isn't going to cost you any more than $50, absolutely tops, to build. They have it at Home Resource too. Yeah, you can get it from Home Resource, and otherwise you can do the panel method, the pallet method, and pallets should be free. You can use scrap lumber and build something like this where you've got some wire on there to keep the load in but allow air to go through. It depends upon how much you want to spend on it. And there's really no reason to spend a lot. There's really other things we can do with our money besides spend money on composting. It can be free. And if you do composting the way I do composting, it is free because, I've got a barn down in the Bitterroot when I can get to it that's full of straw. So my only question is the time and money it takes me to drive down to the Bitterroot Bitterroot, load up a truck full of straw and bring it up. You can buy straw for $5 a bale at Quality Supply. That's where this came from. This actually looks like a pretty good bale, but you really want to pay attention to the bales you're buying. If they're moldy and crappy looking, you can get moldy straw for free. You know, so, but this looks like a good bale.
What's your take on straw and like pesticides used for its production? Like, is it good to get organic straw? And if so,
If you can get organic straw, it's always nice to have organic straw. I just use the straw that, you know, it really, I don't know, you know, if you were going to be doing certified organic gardening, you would probably want to make sure that you had organic straw. So, you know, if you're doing just backyard gardening, local foods, that, you know, yeah, this was probably sprayed with something at some point. I don't know how heavy the hay industry is in the spraying. If you find, you know, around here and around Yellowstone Park, there's a lot of weed-free hay available. And if you find somebody who has weed-free hay and you buy straw from them, they generally are clean. So it really, I've never really known it to be that much of a problem. So it's just not, you know, the pesticide doesn't stay in the product once it's dried and everything that I know of. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. So any questions?
Did you talk about, sorry, I was wondering, did you talk about worm composting
Yeah, so we talked about worm composting.
under your kitchen sink?
You can do that under your kitchen sink. In Japan now, every new apartment has a worm bin right under the counter where you just push a button with your foot, it opens up, and it's right by your chopping block. You can, I know people they have nothing more than a yogurt container sitting under their sink, and that's their worms. And that works. So you can get as big or as small as you want. Some people like to have the worms right inside. I'll probably have mine outside somewhere because I plan on having it, because I have a lot of worms. But, you know, depending upon, you can have a little worm bin inside. If you have a worm bin outside, you have to do something about it in the winter because the worms will freeze and they will die. You can move them inside. Where I'm going to be living at, that's not an option. So what we do is we build like a little storage container to put around them with old styrofoam and then straw, and then they don't have to be that warm. You know, you don't want them freezing, but I've had worms outside at 10 degrees and had them come through it okay because I was able to keep the worm bin hot enough. The other thing we wanted to talk about really, really briefly was fencing for your compost. In some areas, you know, especially if you're living up in the Rattlesnake or you're living up in Patty Canyon, there's wildlife that you want to keep out of your compost bin. And so sometimes it might be necessary to fence it. And the only thing that's really going to keep, you know, the bigger ungulates and that out of your compost bin is electric fencing. And I'm not a big fan of electric fencing, but it is something that sometimes, you know, you might want to, you know, people might want to look into if they're having problems with, you know, especially bears getting into the compost, or if you're in a place where you just simply don't have a dog, that will help keep things like raccoons and that out of your compost. Generally, I rely on the dog to do that, but not everybody has a dog. I've learned that not everybody has a dog that will actually keep anything out of their compost. So, you know, it depends on how useful your animal really is. But, you know, so fencing off the compost can be a useful thing. You know, if you can fence your compost in such a manner to where you can let your chickens into it, that really is a good thing, because it's really a wonderful thing to have chickens in your compost pile because they are turning it as they go. They're also, you know, fertilizing it. So they're just making your compost better. So any other questions?
How much do you sell your worms for?
$10 for a yogurt container, for a, you know, quart yogurt container.
And is that enough to start like a bin under the sink?
Yeah,
That, you know, the plastic.
yeah,
bins?
yeah, that'll be enough.
Okay.
So yeah, we can make arrangements if you want to get a quart of worms from me. So any other questions?
Just do your sign off.
Okay, well, I want to thank Mud for having me here today. I want to thank MCAT for coming down and filming all of this. And once again, my website is www.permibus.org. If you have any questions, it has all of my contact information on it. And if you want to have me come and do a workshop for you, just get a hold of me. I'll be happy to do it. So thanks.
And my name is Beth Ann, and I'm the program director here at MUD. And thank you for joining us for another workshop in our Backyard Sustainability Workshop series. Our workshops range from things like composting with Stan to gardening, sewing, beer making, bread making, beer brewing, all sorts of things. And you can find out more about all of our workshops, our other programs, and everything that we do for the Missoula community at mudproject.org or by stopping by our site, which is at 629 Phillips Street here on the north side. Thanks for joining us.